In 1966, in the sleepy town of Oudendaalsrus in the Free State, two 12-year-old girls, cousins Isifori and Petronel, are kidnapped and murdered. Issi's brother vows to leave no stone unturned in his quest for justice for his sister and cousin. And although it would take more than 20 years, he kept that promise. But the fallout of the brutal murders would take its toll regardless, and the families and communities involved would never be the same. In a brand new drama series based on these true crime events, KykNet explores this case in the series Nuggies. A new episode of Nuggies airs every Tuesday on KykNet, DSTV channel 144 at 8 p.m, and you can catch up with any episodes you've missed on DSTV Stream and Catch Up. He didn't think he'd get away with it for this long. Sure that someone would figure it out within the first year or two. But they hadn't. And so he carried on. For years and years. Digging in deeper and deeper. Finally, when the time came, he would do what needed to be done. After all, it had been a pretty good ride. This is True Crime South Africa. I'm Nicole Engelbrecht, and you're listening to episode 182, The Crimes of Craig Warriner. Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Dial-A-Bed, South Africa's go-to destination for quality sleep. With 83 stores nationwide and a convenient online store, getting the rest you deserve has never been easier. Visit www.dialabed.co.za and wake up to a better you. Since 2019, True Crime South Africa has been telling the stories of the victims of violent crime in South Africa. The podcast is independent. That means no big or even little corporates fund it. And that's just the way I like it. And it's the only independent podcast in South Africa that consistently charts in the top 10. Keeping a podcast like this going is time-consuming. And for the most part, it remains a one-woman process. It's me. I'm the one woman. You, yes you, are the reason this podcast continues to flourish and help bring in tips on missing person and cold cases. If you'd like to help keep the show running, please consider supporting our sponsors, signing up to Patreon or PayPal, follow the show on the socials, as the kids say, and share it with your fellow partners in crime. You can find our social links and learn more about our sponsors at True Crime South Africa/donate. Shout out to this week's Patreon and PayPal superstars. A huge thank you goes out to Kirsty Vermark and Catherine Lamb for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much, everyone. Your support really does make a huge difference. Patreon supporters get one additional exclusive episode a month, a shout-out on the pod, and other exclusive content, including Q&As with me, as and when it's available. It's a minimum of $1 a month. I think you should do it. Please. And thank you. Keba. This week's episode does not involve violent crime. But that doesn't mean that there weren't victims who were deeply harmed. I've covered a few Ponzi schemes on the podcast before, and often they seem like situations the individuals didn't initially anticipate, but got themselves into to get out of a tough situation. but then it spiraled out of control. Most Ponzi schemes only last a few years, but this one lasted almost 2 decades, and as we'll hear, maybe even more than that. In researching this episode, I used a few online articles, including a 3-part investigation piece from MoneyWeb and an article from Savamas. So let's get into episode 182, The Crimes of Craig Warriner.
The following episode may contain sensitive material, including descriptions of violence, sexual assault, or graphic descriptions of injuries to victims. If you feel you may be triggered by such material, please consider this before accessing our content. To access trauma counseling or services, please see the helpline information on our show notes.
Craig Warriner was born in 1964. When he was ready to start school, his parents enrolled him at the prestigious private school St. Stithians in Sandton. The school was originally founded as a boys-only school in 1953. In 1995, it opened a girls' campus as well. St. Stithians runs all the way from grade 1 through to matric. Some students do start there when they start school and stay right up until matric, and others would just do either primary school or high school. The school is steeped in a self-built culture and very big on the community of St. Stithians, with alumni often remaining deeply connected to each other and the school long after they leave. On the boys' school side especially, there's often a culture of those who go on to run their own businesses or work in the business world, seeking out other St. Stithians alumni to do business with if they can. Craig Warriner was one of the pupils who'd started at St. Stithians in grade 1 and remained there all the way through to matric. During his time at the school, Craig participated in athletics, rugby and swimming, and was part of the honours group in matric. Everyone was pretty sure that the future held great things for Craig, and he would be wildly successful, and he was intent on achieving that too, one way or another. Craig was almost always involved in the finance sector during his career. Over the years, he built up an impressive reputation, and as a member of the Old Boys Association for St. Stithians, donated large amounts of money to upgrade school facilities. Some of these facilities were even named after him at the time. Even then, though, there were some who were not quite sure about Warriner. I guess, in fairness, this is not uncommon. You're not always going to be everyone's cup of tea. And it could have appeared that those who didn't like Craig were just jealous. After all, they pointed to his lavish lifestyle, expensive cars, premium liquor, and weekend getaways in Europe as some of the reasons they didn't like him. But looking back, it would seem that those people may have had a point. Despite living a seemingly charmed and luxurious life with his wife and 2 children, Craig wasn't a very public person. Even when social media became relatively accessible in South Africa, he never used it to market his businesses and didn't have much of a public profile there either. Although happy to publicly splurge, he also kept his proverbial cards very close to his chest. And it would eventually be revealed why this may have been. Craig Warriner's client list continued to grow over the years, despite him not advertising. He didn't even have a website. Really, he used the best kind of free advertising any business can hope for, word of mouth. Longer-term clients of Craig Warriner's investment business, BHI Trust, would refer their friends, family members, and colleagues to him. And in turn, those happy clients would refer others. And as long as Craig kept his current clients happy, he automatically got more, with very little effort from him. After all, especially in something like investments, what better surety is there than someone you trust, saying that they know someone who's a sure bet, definitely not a scam, and completely trustworthy. In an industry where there are many fly-by-nights and even more blatant scammers, it's difficult for ordinary individuals who just want to get a decent return on their investment to know where to go. So a personal recommendation is absolute gold. And Craig really did keep his clients happy. He sent monthly statements which showed how their investments were consistently growing, and he processed withdrawal requests quickly, often within 24 hours. No one had any reason to suspect their money was not safe with BHI Trust. The biggest green flag for investors was that Craig wasn't guaranteeing wildly large returns. The return on their investments was quite conservative, often just in line with what other trusts were doing. But they were also very consistent. Craig claimed that he was able to achieve this because he had detailed knowledge of two specific stocks, BHP Billiton and Anglo American, and he used these expertise to trade his clients' money in such a way that he was always banking highs and never exposing them to risk. And that seemed to be proven in the monthly statements. So everyone was happy. At first, records would show that Craig's clients were predominantly wealthy businessmen, people who could invest large amounts of money, millions of rands at a time even. These individuals could often be traced back to contacts Craig had made through St. Stithians. They were either alumni of the school or colleagues through friends of alumni. At some point, though, his client list began to change, and soon he was accepting investments from middle-class people who worked ordinary jobs, individuals who for the most part were investing to secure their retirement and did not have money to lose. In retrospect, there seems to have been many flashpoints in the history of BHI Trust which could have served as markers to its eventual downfall. Small changes that, when taken in retrospective context, make sense, but investors weren't privy to any of that context, and most of them had no idea what was happening behind the scenes at BHI, because to them it was just a company whose services they used. One major turning point for BHI would be the retirement of the only other trustee besides Craig. When Craig sought to replace this trustee, he turned to a man he'd become friendly with through St. Stithians' Old Boys organisation. Christian Ashcroft was not a worldly businessman. He had a degree in sports psychology and had worked very normal jobs throughout his life. He did just fine for himself, but he wasn't a multi-millionaire like Craig Warriner seemed to be. In fact, he'd become quite starstruck by Warriner. He respected him and was keen to learn from him. So when Craig offered him a dual role as his personal assistant and a trustee with BHI, Ashcroft jumped at the opportunity. What Ashcroft didn't know was that even by then, questions were being asked in the industry about BHI and Warriner, and many suspected things were not what they seemed. BHI Trust had built up enough of a positive reputation for itself that it didn't just deal with individuals who wanted to invest directly. Craig also received referrals from financial advisors who were looking for stable investments for their clients and to earn a commission or fee off that sourcing service. These included independent financial advisors and those who worked for firms. 2 investment companies would later be identified as having funneled funds into BHI in return for a commission that was far higher than the industry standard. They seemed to be essentially setting their clients' interests aside and directing their money toward whoever was paying their own company the best commissions, regardless of whether it was a safe investment or not. This seems to be true, because with even a little digging and verification, these firms would have quickly found that BHI Trust was not covering all the legal bases. And we know they would have found this because others did, and they did something about it. We don't know exactly when the first complaints were laid against BHI at the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, or FSCA, but it would later be revealed that there were several over the years. The allegations were also numerous in nature. It was alleged that BHI was charging its customers far higher fees than is normal for the industry. Some also believed that BHI did not have the proper licenses to be operating as what was termed a Category 2 financial services provider. Others believed that BHI was not adhering to the requirements of the various financial legal acts, which help to prevent money laundering. Those taking investments, especially in large amounts, have to know where that money is coming from. It's part of their responsibility to ensure that they're not becoming party to money laundering. And to understand that, you need to gather a good amount of information before agreeing to take on an investment client. But BHI wasn't doing that. Some investment companies dealing with him found that their client intake forms were far too simplistic. And when they questioned this with Craig, he didn't seem too concerned, and also didn't give any indication that he would be correcting the issue. If the FSCA did look into these occasional complaints, not much happened. And the truth is that these identified issues were problematic, but they were just the tip of the iceberg. The truth of what Craig Warriner was up to was much, much worse. Warriner claims that his troubles began during the 2008-2009 global economic downturn. The 2008 financial crisis, also known as the Global Financial Crisis, or GFC, was a major worldwide economic crisis which started in the United States and triggered the Great Recession of late 2007 to mid-2009. The most severe economic downturn since the 1929 Wall Street crash and Great Depression. Some sources indicate that the GFC resulted in at least 900,000 people losing their jobs in South Africa over the long term, as the economy struggled to fight back against a global reduction in investment and trade. Even wealthy South Africans, some of those among Craig's client list, felt the impact, and many withdrew investments to fund other areas of their lives and businesses. Craig Warriner says that although he'd managed to wade through this, when the upturn took longer than expected to happen, he started making decisions that were highly unethical. In fact, they were illegal. When clients wanted to withdraw their investments, he said he didn't have enough capital to fund it, and so he started using new clients' investments to pay back withdrawing clients. What Craig was doing is called a Ponzi scheme. If you've listened to some of the other Ponzi scheme cases I've covered on this podcast, you'll have heard this definition already, but it's worth repeating for new listeners. The Ponzi scheme is named after Charles Ponzi, who was a fraudster of Italian heritage who lived and pulled off his scams in the United States and Canada in the 1920s. The characteristic of this type of scheme is exactly what Craig was doing. New investors' money is used to pay out returns and full withdrawals to older clients. In many Ponzi schemes, there's absolutely no real business happening. It's very simply a recycling of money until the cycle dries up and the scheme is exposed. With BHI, it does look like Craig was still trading a bit, but whatever he was making was a drop in the ocean when it came to how much he needed to have in the trust to pay clients. But Craig Warriner was very clearly running a Ponzi scheme. Whether or not he'd been doing so from the beginning is difficult to say, but at least from 2008 onward, he most certainly was knowingly doing so. While some of the complaints to the FSCA began to be investigated, the real nail in the coffin would come when Warriner's freshly appointed trustee and personal assistant, Christian Ashcroft, began to see things his mentor was doing that, even with all his admiration for the man, he could not look past. In 2020, the FSCA's investigation had already identified several contraventions, but strangely, nothing was done. Craig was not stopped from trading, and most of his clients seemed completely oblivious that he was being investigated. By 2023, though, new information had come to light, and simultaneously, Ashcroft was starting to push Warriner to be honest with him and own up to what the real situation was. Ashcroft had not just worked for BHI, he'd also invested his entire inheritance in it. So he quickly realized that if his suspicions were correct, he may well have lost his money, and as a trustee of BHI, he might well be in line for legal action himself. During the 2023 investigation into BHI, the scope extended into external entities which had kept the scheme liquid. This included 2 companies, Global and Local Investment Advisors and Global Capital, who were specifically named as investment firms who had brought clients to BHI and in turn received larger than normal commissions for doing so. Finally, completely disillusioned by his once mentor and terrified of the possible consequences for himself, Christian Ashcroft went to the police to tell them what he knew about what Craig Warriner was doing. Around the same time, a concerning email went out to BHI's clients. It warned clients that if they wanted to withdraw their money from the trust, they should send their requests within the next 2 weeks. It didn't say what would happen if they didn't, but by the 12th of October 2023, no one had to wonder anymore when Craig Warriner walked into Sandton Police Station and handed himself over. When Craig's confession to police came to light, his clients were horrified. He admitted to having mismanaged the trust for 22 years, with the real death knell coming in 2008 and 2009, and he'd spent the next 15 years trying to make up for what he'd lost. He acknowledged, though, that there was no way to do it. Of the close to 3 billion rand BHI had taken in from around 2,000 clients, there was just 4 million rand left in the account when it was frozen shortly after Warriner's arrest. St. Stithians reacted quickly to Warriner's admissions, making a public statement saying that the school had never made any investments with the company and their only connection was that they'd received some donations from Warriner. In acknowledging that the sports facilities built with those monies may well have come from tainted hands, the school rector said that they would be renaming the areas which currently held Warriner's name. From the moment Craig had walked into that police station, he seemed eager to get things wrapped up. By the time he appeared in court 6 days after his arrest, he was insisting that he was ready to plead guilty to any charges the prosecution wanted to present against him. The judge explained to him that the purpose of that hearing was not for him to plead, and that he now had the opportunity to get legal representation while the prosecution finalized the investigation. As the matter was quite complex, it may take some time, and Warriner would be given the opportunity to apply for bail in the meantime. But Craig was not happy with that. He didn't want legal representation, he said. Couldn't afford it anyway. He also said he couldn't understand why any further investigation was necessary. It was a waste of time. He'd already told them everything they needed to know, and he'd agreed with the prosecution that he would identify those who'd aided him in his scheme. Couldn't they just let him plead and sentence him? The judge, slightly taken aback, explained to Warriner that this was not the way the justice system worked. Craig told the judge that he didn't want to apply for bail, but requested that he be given a single cell as he'd received death threats and was concerned he would not be safe among other prisoners. Although these alleged death threats were never confirmed, it appeared that Warriner was saying that they were from people whose money he'd stolen, and presumably that was why he didn't want bail either. He'd probably be safer in prison. Whether or not this was true, I can kind of understand it might be. People with lots of money are great friends, but people with lots of money are also the wrong people to be on the wrong side of. That money can buy a lot of things, and it wouldn't take much of it to get an awaiting trial prisoner to take someone out for them. Also in the courtroom that day was an attorney who was not part of the legal proceedings for either the prosecution or the defence. Vanna Kaywood of Kaywood Attorneys had known Craig and had been involved with BHI Trust since 2009, when he, in his personal capacity, had invested a large amount of money with the man. BHI had been suggested to him as an investment option by several of his clients, and it had sounded like a secure opportunity. And for 14 years, it had seemed to be just that, until it wasn't. And now, Kaywood sat in the courtroom taking notes, preparing to represent his own interests as well as those of colleagues and friends who had initially recommended BHI. Kaywood would go on to be an integral part of pushing forward the investigation into Craig Warriner and BHI and driving the sequestration of both and the freezing of the assets in hopes that he and his colleagues might just be able to get something back from their investments. During the initial court hearings, it became clear that Craig had pointed the finger at Global and Local and Global Capital as businesses who'd aided him in his scheme. It emerged that Global and Local especially had been operating at incredibly high levels in the South African investment scene. Long-standing and well-respected firms like Investec and Allan Gray had financial advisors on their books who had been dealing with Global and Local, and some, as a result, had links to BHI too. Both businesses immediately ordered those advisors to break any ties they had with Global and Local. As BHI was officially placed under sequestration, a website was set up for the victims of the scheme to follow along with updates. The website, insolventbhi.com, still exists today. Court documents identified 220 of the 2,000 total clients of BHI over the years who appeared to have been directly exposed to losses as a result of the Ponzi scheme. These were at least the identifiable individuals who had not managed to withdraw their funds in time. There is a very odd dynamic in Ponzi scheme investigations and litigation, where a fine line exists between those who are legally victims and those who are actually complicit. Actually, there's really no line. Technically, everyone who benefits from a criminal enterprise is guilty of receiving illegal funds. But of course, ordinary investors in BHI would have been doing so unknowingly. For the most part, unless police could prove that an investor was absolutely complicit in the scheme, those who were unwittingly part of a Ponzi scheme aren't prosecuted. But then they've usually been punished enough as it is, because the vast majority don't even get a fraction of their money back, if anything. Once these schemes are uncovered and bank accounts are frozen and assets are seized, money slowly gets fed back into an allocated auditing firm account. But even once a case is finalised and those funds can be redispersed, the auditing firm takes their payment first, and then SARS takes any money owed to them before any money is distributed back to victims. This can take up to 10 years, if not more. Additionally, because any dividends received from a fraudulent fund are gains of a criminal enterprise, the victims can and often are made to pay those dividends back to the fund account. Essentially, just kicking people when they're already down. For BHI's very wealthy clients, this may have been a hit, but not totally devastating. But Warriner had started to gather a lot of middle-class clients, ordinary individuals who'd invested their retirement funds. Some had even sold their houses to invest that money in BHI and then used their monthly dividends to pay rent while their money grew, or so they thought. As the investigation continued and Warriner remained in prison, victims started to come forward, and it became clear just how deeply his actions had impacted the lives of very ordinary South Africans. One pensioner told a journalist, quote, "I lost 3 million rand of my pension money in this. Fortunately for me, I didn't put all my money in one basket, so I'm fine. But I know people who put their pensions and sold their houses to invest in this. They've lost it all. They now have to rely on their children for support." End quote. Another investor who'd sold his house and put the money into BHI said, quote, "I should have diversified. It was greed. I would see my statement telling me I was up 200,000 rand, and I was happy. I could also get my money out in 24 hours. End quote. Even though BHI's returns weren't wildly high like some Ponzi schemes, they were strangely consistent. One investor said he sometimes wondered how the returns were possible. Quote, "But when half the neighbourhood's invested and everyone's talking about it, it affirms your decision. Besides, my financial advisor was putting all his clients' money into the scheme, as well as his own, so I thought it must be legitimate." End quote. And that is exactly how these schemes work. When well-educated, financially savvy people who you respect and admire are invested, it provides that social proof that we so often seek when making decisions. Everyone's doing it, or saying it, so it must be true. Our instincts do kick in, give us those little doubts, but we push them down as signs that we're too risk-averse, or we're overthinking things. Family bonds were also decimated by the scheme. 81-year-old Bruce Smith and his 58-year-old daughter Karen lost a combined 6.9 million rand. Bruce's ex-wife and his sons-in-law also lost large amounts of money. Bruce's son was left responsible for supporting both his mother, who was left with nothing, as well as his in-laws. Karen said that she'd harboured deep resentment over what had happened, especially because the person who'd recommended BHI to them was a family member, who she chose not to name to the journalist. The resentment came in because the family member had managed to withdraw all of his money before Craig was arrested, and didn't warn his family to do the same. She said that the entire family refused to speak with him anymore, and he hadn't tried to make contact with them either. At Warriner's next court appearance, a forensic investigator representing about 200 of the victims voiced his concern that the police investigation was being led by Craig Warriner's confession. Bart Henderson said that he got the distinct impression that rather than conducting a full investigation into BHI and all its affiliates, they were using the information Craig gave them and allowing that to guide what they looked into. The police denied this, admitting that Warriner had been very helpful in their investigation and they did have to rely on him for access to documentation they needed, but claimed they were not allowing themselves to be led by Warriner at all. Henderson also pointed at the regulators, including the FSCA, who he said continued to show a complete disregard for the safety of investors and failed to act earlier on when losses could have been minimised. He said that this was a pattern he'd seen in other big Ponzi and pyramid scheme investigations, when it's so often revealed that questions had been asked for years, and the regulators had failed to act until the police had eventually gotten involved when it was too late. At the time that the police investigation was ongoing, several other bodies were also simultaneously investigating, including the FSCA, who eventually officially announced that they had disbarred Craig Warriner from providing any financial services for the next 30 years. Despite initially declining to apply for bail, Craig appeared to change his mind after the investigation revealed that direct transfers had been made from BHI Trust into his personal accounts, and all his assets were completely frozen. I do wonder whether or not these two things were resultants of one another. Perhaps Craig's prison time had been made far easier because he had access to some money, and once the flow of that was stemmed, he was suddenly just another prisoner. Either way, his bail application was denied, and he remained incarcerated until the investigation against him was completed. Charges were finalised, and he was given the opportunity to enter a plea. All along, Craig Warriner had continued to insist that if the NPA would just put the charges to him, he would plead guilty to anything. He regularly expressed his apparent remorse at what he'd done and said he would accept up to 20 years in prison as his punishment in exchange for his guilty pleas. 206 charges of fraud were eventually formulated against him, and an additional count for operating without the required FSP license. It emerged that the FSP license number Warriner had been using had belonged to a company he'd been employed by at one time. The company had no idea that he was using their details and license number for BHI Trust, and the license number actually didn't even cover the type of investments he was handling. But it seemed no one had taken that closer look. They'd just seen a number and accepted that it was valid. The charge sheet also detailed just how little trading Warriner was actually doing. Of the close to 3 billion rand which had entered the BHI account, only about 500,000 rand had ever been transferred into the accounts he used for trading. And even though Warriner himself had admitted that the fraud had been going on pretty much from 2009, the actual investigation only focused from 2020 to 2023. So the real scale of the total deception was astonishingly higher than 3 billion rand. Although in the plea deal, Warriner had agreed to a 20-year sentence, this deal is only between the accused and the prosecution, and essentially details what the prosecution will ask the judge to sentence the accused to. It doesn't in any way control the judge's ultimate decision. The judge is not bound by a plea agreement, and if they feel that a harsher or even lighter sentence is appropriate, they have the right to hand down such a sentence. For the accused, it's a roll of the dice. But it's a less risky roll of the dice than going in with a not guilty plea, and the prosecution possibly requesting the highest sentence possible. And Craig Warriner was clearly not a risk-averse man. So he rolled the dice and lost, although not by much. The total number of years handed down was more than 500, but all of those would be served concurrently. And in determining a period of incarceration, the judge decided that 25 years would be more fair to the victims than 20. He would be eligible for parole in 12 and a half years. Although legal justice had seemingly been served, none of this really helped the victims at all. And many organisations representing groups of the victims maintained similar opinions to Bart Henderson, saying that the investigation had not been transparent and there had been no information provided about exactly how Warriner had benefited personally from the scheme. After all, pretty much right up until the end, Craig was living a relatively charmed life. His adult children were living overseas, and he'd divorced his wife. He still drove very expensive cars, drank only the best alcohol, ate in pricey restaurants, lived in an upmarket area, and took weekend trips to Europe. And a good chunk of that, if not all of it, had to have come from the proceeds of his criminal enterprise. But none of that was discussed in court or entered into the public record. There was also very little information about any affiliates who may have aided BHI, and having the investigation only cover a 3-year time span had not given a true picture of the level of deceit Warriner had been waging. Hope fled again, though, when just a week after the sentence was handed down, 2 other men were arrested in connection with the Ponzi scheme. Sona Pillay was the head of a company called Rubicon, and Michael Haldane was the founder of Global and Local. Both companies had been identified as possibly helping to steer a huge number of new investors to BHI and receiving large commissions in return. In addition, they'd both handled administrative functions for the fraudulent fund, which included issuing statements to investors each month. These statements, of course, were shown to be completely fake. The only realistic number on them was the opening amounts paid in by the investors. As with Craig Warriner's arrest, the actual arrests were just part of an ongoing investigation, and the men could expect quite some time to pass before they appeared in court again. If the victims of BHI were hoping that this would help to reveal more avenues their money could have been funneled into and increase the chances they'd get something back, they would be disappointed when just last month, in March 2025, the charges against the men were dropped. Michael Haldane, however, was disbarred from working in the financial services sector for the next 30 years as a result of a parallel FSCA investigation. Craig Warriner had been so helpful in the investigation, so insistent that he just wanted to plead guilty and get the whole ordeal done with, that many people had to wonder why. Had the man really suddenly had an attack of conscience and been overwhelmed by remorse? Or was his seeming desperation to close things up actually aimed at covering things up? Although many people were very angry with Craig Warriner for his deception and fraud, some had been able to take solace from the fact that he'd been so remorseful for what he'd done, and they had taken his explanation about how he'd come to be running a Ponzi scheme as proof that they hadn't really completely misjudged this man. He'd just been quite overwhelmed by a global downturn that had destroyed so many lives, and he hadn't wanted to let people down, so he tried to earn it back somehow. This version was easier for many to stomach. It was easier to believe that he'd just gotten way in over his head while trying to fix a problem that he hadn't initially created. But soon, a man who'd been in the awaiting trial section of prison with Warriner would make claims that would bring all of that into question. Jacobus van Rensburg was a chartered accountant who'd been arrested and detained while awaiting trial on an assault charge. The man spent almost a year in prison before being released when the charges against him were withdrawn. During that time, he'd shared a cell with Craig Warriner. Van Rensburg said he'd witnessed Warriner getting his hands on an iPhone behind bars and using it to stay in touch with the outside world. Warriner allegedly also continued trading on an online platform, and according to Van Rensburg, the last time he saw the man's trading account, he'd had about 600,000 rand in it. Warriner had also told Van Rensburg that he'd been working with clients while incarcerated and had helped a man named Michael to move $250 million from South Africa overseas to aid the man in avoiding tax authorities on both sides of the world. He then started to blackmail this man named Michael, telling him that if he didn't transfer money to him, he would reveal his illegal activities to the police. After all, what did Warriner have to lose? He was already in prison. He told Van Rensburg that the main reason he'd handed himself over to police was because one specific client had lost 150 million rand, and the man was allegedly involved in the underworld and had put out a hit on Warriner. He'd figured he'd be safer in prison than outside, which was apparently the other reason he hadn't wanted bail. Warriner had used the money he'd had before his accounts were frozen, and later from deals he was making from prison, to buy a smooth ride behind bars. He refused to eat the prison food and paid people to bring him takeaways, meat and milk. Van Rensburg said Warriner came across as very arrogant, and despite his current place in life, rather pleased with himself. One of the most chilling moments he'd had with his cellmate was when Craig had been reading an article written about BHI, and he'd smirked and told Van Rensburg, "They don't even know the half of it." He also regularly told his fellow inmates how he'd been so smart about hiding money from BHI that it had been pretty much untraceable to the authorities in their investigation. Despite all of this bragging about how great he and his life was, Van Rensburg also noticed that Warriner didn't get any personal visits while he was in prison. The only people who came to see him were investigators or lawyers. This didn't seem to bother Warriner, though. When he experienced a gap in income, he reached out to his ex-wife and an old friend, and they came through for him by paying over some money. Neither visited, though. Van Rensburg explained to the journalist he spoke to that he'd wanted to speak out so that people knew what Warriner was really like. His victims deserved that, he said. Forensic investigator Bart Henderson continues to look into BHI and has written a series of articles about his findings for MoneyWeb. Henderson believes that the missing money has likely been moved out of the country using 11 different small front companies and financial vehicles such as trusts that he's identified during his investigation. He reiterates that he believes the SAPS's investigation for the prosecution of Craig Warriner and the attempted prosecution of Haldane and Pillay were empty vessels, as it was completely led by Warriner's own confession, and investigators did not look into anything that the man had not already identified. And he's probably right. Craig Warriner said it himself. They don't even know the half of it. Warriner's seeming desperation to plead guilty and quickly get the case wrapped up likely had absolutely nothing to do with him being remorseful. Rather, he wanted to avoid having to testify and answer the really hard questions. He wanted investigators to focus solely on what he gave them. He was essentially conducting a multi-billion rand sleight of hand trick. Look over here at this that I'm giving you. Focus on it. See how important this information is. And while you're looking over there, the other hand is performing the real trick. A disappearing act. Ponzi schemes like this are becoming more and more common. Bart Henderson says he has several come across his desk every week of varying sizes. And why wouldn't they? Because, yes, there are decent sentences attached to the crimes, but you have to catch them first. And if one man can get away with it for 2 decades, and actually still continues to get away with the vast majority of it, then why wouldn't others try it? The more desperate South Africans become to secure their financial futures, the more this is going to continue happening at increasing scales. Where there is vulnerable prey, there will always be predators. If you'd like to hear more victim-focused true crime content, please subscribe to True Crime South Africa on Spotify or the platform you're using to listen right now. If you're looking for something still related to real-life stories, but often with a more positive slant, you can check out my new podcast series, I Lived Through This. You can follow both podcasts on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, thank you for your support, and I'll chat to you soon.